good place to start would be if you could just unpack environmental inequities for us.
When we're speaking of environmental inequities, generally referring to situations where African Americans, Latinos, or BMAE citizens here in the UK or minorities elsewhere, non-whites more broadly, suffer disproportionate public health impacts from the effects of pollution or environmental degradation. Most scholars and observers would agree that the environmental justice movement began in 1982 in Warren County, North Carolina, because it was there that tens of thousands of polychlorinated biphenyls, also known as PCBs, which are toxic in waste oil, were dumped along rural roads in North Carolina. Although the perpetrators were convicted and sent to jail for doing that, the waste still had to be collected, and then disposed of legally somewhere. But of course, that's not the sort of thing that anybody really wants in their backyard. State officials in North Carolina chose the small town of Afrin within Warren County, whose population was poor and overwhelmingly African American. Not surprisingly, that was seen as deeply unfair. And since that time, the environmental justice movement has been about trying to make sure that non-white citizens don't suffer disproportionate health costs from environmental pollution. So that's a classic example of an environmental inequity. And it's the sort of thing that you see in the UK as well, but probably more with respect to air pollution and poorer populations living next to very busy roads. The movement was further galvanized in 1987 by a study from the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, which showed that race was the most significant factor when deciding where to locate hazardous waste facilities, right? And who bears the health burden of living close to toxic waste and close to landfills.
Could you give our listeners an example of the nature of successful policies to dealing with these inequalities?
It turns out the environmental inequities are not easy to deal with. A lot of these causes are deeply entrenched, which also gets at the issues of systemic racism. It's difficult to pinpoint like specific successes, but I guess I would say where civil society can play as much of a role as possible. So where you have local groups who are aware of what's going on, local groups, activist groups with also the expertise to understand environmental problems, who understand the law, who understand the levels of recourse available to them. These sorts of groups that are in a position to maybe make the link between certain types of pollution and certain types of public health problems that are going on, because these links are not always easy to establish. And businesses or other polluters are often going to be very eager to find ways to avert blame. Having civil society there also helps local groups to feel like the box of procedural justice has been ticked, right? So at least local groups feel like they have a voice. And I know that's a very broad answer. It's partly because there is not really one set of policies. And I would say that there's actually many more ways in which the deck is stacked against solving these problems of environmental justice, right? And so some ways in which that's the case. In the United States, the Clean Air Act, right, the Clean Water Act, tend to be, they're federal laws, which don't always have a lot of room for local implementation, right? There's some, but there's not always the amount of flexibility that you want to deal with place-based problems. And environmental inequities are very much place-based problems. So the laws don't always have the flexibility built into them to deal with these sort of. One final point here. The United States system is it's unique and it's different, but it's got a system built in where governments are often overseeing other governments in order to deliver environmental justice. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 allows different groups to complain to the Environmental Protection Agency about the performance of local governments, right? If certain civil society groups believe that local governments are not doing enough to deal with pollution, they're not dealing with environmental inequities properly, they can complain to the Environmental Protection Agency about it. Evidence shows that most of the time these complaints are listened to by the EPA, but they don't ultimately go anywhere. There's not a lot of recourse. And governments are not likely to regulate other governments the same way they regulate business, right? They don't come after them with the same level of severity. And there could be a number of reasons for that. One of them is that they have to continue as partners, right, within this regulatory system. So there's a little bit of evidence that governments overseeing other governments doesn't work. And yet that's one of the primary methods of recourse for dealing with environmental justice in the United States. So, as I said, the deck is stacked in some ways against achieving environmental justice a lot of times. But one way that we can deal with this is making sure that there are more robust outlets for civil society at the local level to understand what's going on and to deliver procedural justice and give those populations a voice in what's happening.
So I get the impression from your answer that civil society certainly will have a central role. Do you see this as kind of a continual commitment on the part of an engaged citizenry? Is that how you see that the main hope that we have for solving these issues?
With regard to environmental issues, it's a very important one. At the same time, you have to have good data as well to understand these things. You have to understand like where pollution is happening, where the land is toxic, but also who's living in those areas, right? What are you dealing with low income populations there? And so you have to be able to link these things. It's not always easy to link them causally, right? So to be able to have the information to identify these things is important, right? And so civil society is more likely going to care about these things, right? They're the ones more likely. But you also have to have governments in place that care about these things also. So the Obama administration poured a lot of resources into dealing with environmental inequities. The Trump administration obviously has a reputation for being for trying to undo many of the environmental initiatives of the Obama administration. One thing that doesn't get as much attention internationally is that state governments in the United States have succeeded in stymieing the Trump administration quite a bit. Many state attorneys general in the United States have been successful at stopping the Trump administration from undoing some of the environmental initiatives. And of course, the Trump administration they're the ones who are going to decide how enthusiastically they regulate and what sort of enforcement actions they bring. So you need a government on top who's going to be more enthusiastic about these things. But yes, in order to understand the problems, civil society is one of the main ways that we can keep abreast of things and help local populations to have a voice in what's going on.
The reactions that we've seen to the murder of George Floyd, well, they've been global. They've also been relatively extensive comparatively to, say, previous reactions to injustices. A lot of the conversation concerning COVID-19 has been based around disparities felt along racial and socioeconomic lines in terms of the amount of exposure to the disease, but also to those who've suffered most severely. It's seen as through much more of a kind of interconnected lens. How much would you attribute that to a paradigm shift with concerns to our definitions of things like fairness, our expectations of government? How much does that represent shifting ideas of those notions?
In terms of whether it's really paradigm shifting, there's so much work to do, right? There's so far to go. What I can say is that even prior to the death of George Floyd, right, when we were well into things with COVID, there was already deep recognition that COVID was hitting African Americans and non-whites, disproportionately, not only in the U.S. but with Black populations in the UK as well. There's evidence that it's hitting Pakistani and Bangladeshi families and communities much harder in the UK. And then there's a number of reasons for that. One reason is that African Americans, just like Bangladeshi and Pakistanis in the UK, tend to do a lot more jobs where they can't work from home, which is a blessing I have. It's part of my privilege, no doubt. That's one reason why you see, a greater cost exacted by COVID upon African American populations. With the death of George Floyd, conversation is going in many different directions and productive directions. I think you've got the initial discussion, or what are some of the basic things we can do? So right now we're talking a lot about statues and important symbolic things. And these are important, no doubt, but removing a statue, even if it antagonizes a lot of the population, is not as difficult as dealing with, things like environmental inequities, right? And environmental inequities is what we've been talking about, but this is just one thing, right? You can look at many different areas about how non-whites live in the United States and how they deal with these same systemic problems. So, we know about the evidence with regard to African Americans and the criminal justice system, right? There's significant bias within the criminal justice system from start to finish. There's a number of ways in which in which society discriminates against non-whites. And these are things that, if we're really serious about the legacy of George Floyd and continuing this, we have to think hard about these issues. It's great to take down certain statues, right? And for NASCAR to ban the Confederate flag, and it's also great that the corporate world has expressed so much sympathy with Black Lives Matter. But of course, those corporations need to look at some of these other deeper problems, right? A lot of us would argue that, well, you need to deliver on things like sick pay. So, if we do have a second wave and there's another lockdown, you need to make it so that employees can stay home without worrying about losing their jobs, this sort of thing. And I mean, I would argue that these are the things that really need to be just acknowledged first, right? I mean, these are the sort of problems that a lot of people don't understand, haven't looked at. So they need to be acknowledged in greater numbers before we can even really think about how to move forward with that. But greater awareness on those deeper systemic problems would be a great start with this current movement as well.